Welcome to the adventure of the Cuckmere Curate, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Sherlock Holmes, the Sussex Apocrypha, playing in the year 1919. Long after my friend's final days, a coded ledger from his retirement in Sussex came to light. It contained the bones of cases Holmes considered too personal, or indeed too strange, for my contemporary chronicles. In those years he faced not the London underworld, but the quiet shadows of a changing world. These accounts, which I have since deciphered, form a sort of Sussex Apocrypha. I shall begin with an affair that touched our own small parish, a tragedy which the authorities dismissed, but which Holmes knew held a deeper, more sinister truth. I have titled this account, The Adventure of the Cuckmere Curate. Chapter 1. The retirement Sherlock Holmes had sought upon the Sussex Downs was, in theory, a tranquil affair of beekeeping and contemplation, yet a familiar restlessness stirred in him that autumn. A persistent sea wind rattled the window frames of our cottage, driving rain against the glass. The only sounds to break the gale's howl were the fire's crackle and the sharp rustle of a page, as Holmes turned it with impatience. Our peace was broken not by a frantic client, but by our housekeeper, Martha Hudson. The door flew open on a gust of damp air, and she bustled in, face flushed and breathless. She set a tea tray down with a clatter that betrayed her agitation. "It is not the tea that has brought you here in such a state, Mrs. Hudson. Your shawl is still beaded with rain, and there is a smudge of chalk mud on your hem. You have run from the village with news," remarked Sherlock Holmes. His voice, though calm, cut through the room's quiet hum. Mrs. Hudson paused, one hand pressed to her chest, as if to still a fluttering heart. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, it's terrible. It's the new curate, the Reverend Albright. They've pulled him from the Cuckmere," responded Martha Hudson. Holmes raised an eyebrow, his eyes never leaving the pages of his monograph on the polyphonic motets of Lassus. "A drowning. A tragedy for the parish, I am sure, but hardly a matter that requires my attention. The local constabulary is more than capable of handling an accidental death," Sherlock Holmes noted. "But that's just it, sir. They say it was an accident, that he must have slipped on the wet bank. But I saw him. I saw him only yesterday, leaving the woodcarver's cottage," replied Martha Hudson, her voice lowered, taking on a confidential and earnest tone that finally captured Holmes's full attention. He closed his book with a soft snap. "He was a good man, Mr. Holmes. So kind to those poor Belgians who came over during the war, especially the De Vries family. But yesterday, he looked like a man who had seen a ghost. His face was pale as a sheet, and his eyes, they were wide with a fear so profound it chilled me to the bone." "That was not a man about to have an accident, sir. That was a man running from something," Martha Hudson said. A silence fell, filled only by the drumming of rain on the roof. Holmes rose and began to pace before the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaunt features flickering in the firelight. Fear, the most potent of human emotions, and the most revealing. "An accident is a matter of chance, Mrs. Hudson, but terror is a matter of cause and effect." "You say he worked with the Belgian refugees?" deduced Sherlock Holmes. "Yes, sir, tirelessly. He helped them find lodging, work. He was their champion here," Martha Hudson replied. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face me. I saw it then, the familiar glint of intellectual fire in his eyes, a spark I had feared his retirement had extinguished for good. The beekeeper was gone, and the detective had returned. "Watson, the official mind is a wonderfully blunt instrument, is it not? It sees a body in the water and hastily concludes a slip on a wet bank, utterly ignoring the emotional prelude. A man filled with mortal terror does not simply go for a stroll by a treacherous river. No, his actions are dictated by that which he fears," explained Sherlock Holmes. He strode towards the hall, his lethargy vanished, replaced by the electric energy I knew so well. "The game, Watson, is afoot once more. It seems my retirement must be postponed. We shall take a walk to the Cuckmere ourselves. "I have a sudden desire to see the spot where a man can be so frightened that he tumbles into eternity," declared Sherlock Holmes. "Our journey from Sussex was brief, yet we seemed to cross vast distances between worlds. From Holmes's feigned contentment in retirement to the grim reality of his true calling, we met Dr. Reed near the Seven Sisters, and together made our way to the riverbank. The Cuckmere wound through the valley, a placid silver ribbon under a grey sky. The air was still, the silence broken only by the mournful cry of a curlew and the gentle lapping of water against the chalky shore. "This is the spot, Holmes. Just here, where the bank softens to mud and reeds." "His body was found caught in that thicket downstream," Dr. Alistair Reed replied. Reed pointed with his walking stick, his voice steady, the professional tone of a man accustomed to tragedy. The ground was indeed disturbed, the grass trampled in a manner that spoke of a grim and heavy task. As Holmes stood at the water's edge, his tall, spare figure a stark silhouette against the pale downs, a sudden crunch of heavy boots on the gravel path announced another's approach. A portly man in a constable's uniform came to a halt beside us. His face was ruddy, puffed with a sense of his own importance. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes? Constable Davies here. Dr. Reed said you might be interested. Sad business this, but straightforward enough." Poor chap slipped on the wet chalk. "Nasty current we've got here, deceptive-like," replied Constable Davies. Holmes offered no reply, his gaze sweeping from the water to the steep bank and back again. His eyes, which had seemed languid only moments before, now glittered with a familiar, predatory focus. He knelt suddenly, the dry reeds rustling as his long fingers brushed against a flattened patch near the water's edge. "The man was found downstream, you say, Doctor, yet the disturbance is greatest here. Tell me, Constable, was anything noted of his personal effects?" Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. As the constable puffed out his chest, clearly pleased to be consulted, yet eager to dismiss the matter. His pockets were empty, save for a handkerchief and a few shillings. Standard enough. The only oddity, if you can call it that, was a little wooden toy he was clutching. Tightly, mind you. "Had to pry it from his fingers," Constable Davies answered. Holmes rose to his feet, his movements economical and precise. A new energy seemed to flow through him, a current far stronger than that of the river before us. "A toy, you say? What sort of toy?" Sherlock Holmes said. "A little bird, carved from wood. A cuckoo, I'd wager. Rather well made for what it is. A trifle, no doubt. A keepsake, perhaps, from one of those Belgian children the Reverend was always fussing over." "It has no bearing on the case," Constable Davies said. Holmes's thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was deceptively mild, yet it cut through the damp air with the sharpness of glass. "My entire career, Constable, has been a study of trifles. You have, I trust, retained this insignificant object," Sherlock Holmes said. "Why, yes. It is at the station, logged with his other effects," said Constable Davies. "Excellent. Do not part with it on any account. I shall call upon you later this afternoon to inspect it. For now, Watson, our work here is done. The serene surface of the Cuckmere has told us all it can," observed Sherlock Holmes. As we turned to leave, I glanced back at the placid water. It seemed no longer serene, but secretive, guarding a truth that lay far beneath its calm facade. And I knew with absolute certainty that the key to unlocking that secret was no longer here, but lay waiting for us in a constable's office, in the form of a small, wooden cuckoo. We left the river bank, the damp, earthy scent of the Cuckmere clinging to our coats. We made our way towards the small constabulary office, and the crunch of our boots on the gravel path pierced the afternoon stillness, each step a small explosion in the hushed air. Holmes walked with a renewed vigour, his earlier languor entirely dispelled by the promise of a tangible, if curious, piece of evidence. The local constable is a man of limited imagination, Watson. He sees a drowning and a trinket. I see a contradiction that cries out for resolution, Sherlock Holmes noted. The constable, a stout man whose tunic strained at the buttons, met us at his door. The office behind him smelled of stale pipe smoke and damp wool. He produced a small, cloth-wrapped bundle, with an air of weary indulgence. Holmes accepted it, and the rasp of the coarse fabric being unwrapped was loud in the quiet room. His long, nimble fingers revealed the object within, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a cuckoo poised as if to call. It was a charming little thing, yet in the context of our grim task, it felt profoundly alien. "There you are, Mr. Holmes. A bit of foreign folderol, if you ask me. Found it clutched tight in the poor fellow's right hand, we did." "Queer business, that," responded local constable. "My thanks, constable. You may have dismissed this as a trifle, but it is often upon the smallest of details that the greatest of cases turn." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. With a curt nod, Holmes turned, and we stepped back into the village street. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and from a nearby smithy came the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil. He did not pocket the bird, but held it in his palm, studying it intently as we walked towards the parish church, whose grey stone spire rose against the pale Sussex sky. A few villagers eyed us with open curiosity, their quiet conversations ceasing as we passed. "Observe the style of carving, Watson. The deep, angular cuts. It is not English work. It has the flavour of the continent. Flemish, I should venture. Our late curate was not carrying a simple keepsake. This was a message, or a marker," replied Sherlock Holmes. He stopped before an elderly woman, tending a small plot beside the churchyard wall. The sweet, heavy scent of late-blooming roses hung in the air around her. He tipped his hat, his voice softening from its usual sharp tenor. "Good day, madam. We are making some inquiries on behalf of the late Mr. Albright." "A fine man, I am told," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. "Oh, a saint on earth, that one was. Never a crossword. Brought my sister a broth when she was ill, and spent hours with those poor Belgian souls, just listening. A true tragedy, that's what it is. A light gone out." Parishioner answered, "Indeed. In your time with him, did you ever see him with an object such as this?" Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He opened his palm. The woman peered at the wooden cuckoo, her brow furrowed in thought, and she made a soft clicking sound with her tongue. "A little bird?" "No, never. He carried his Bible, and a kind word, that's all. Lived as simply as a sparrow, our Mr. Albright." Parishioner replied, "We received much the same account from a shopkeeper and the verger of the church. The Reverend Mr. John Albright was painted as a paragon of virtue, selfless, pious, charitable, and without a single earthly attachment. The portrait was so immaculate as to be unbelievable. They describe a man without edges, Watson, a man too perfect. It is a carefully constructed narrative, but this small bird does not fit within it. It is the one discordant note in an otherwise flawless symphony," deduced Sherlock Holmes. "Holmes, it's staring us in the face. The Belgians. Every single person we've spoken to mentions his devotion to them. It cannot be a coincidence." Dr. John Watson added, "Precisely, my dear Watson. The thread has been there all along. A Flemish carving, in the hand of a drowned English curate who spent his time with Belgian refugees. The connection is elementary." "Come, our inquiries are not finished," explained Sherlock Holmes. He turned on his heel and led the way down a narrow lane that sloped away from the village green. The tidy English cottages gave way to a cluster of repurposed farm buildings, a large tithe barn and several outbuildings, loaned by a local landowner for the refugees' use. The air here changed. The scent of roses was replaced by the smell of wood smoke, boiled cabbage, and damp earth. We saw figures moving in the shadows of the barn, women mending clothes on a bench, their faces etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. A few children played a quiet, listless game with stones, their laughter muted. It was a small, self-contained world of displacement, a pocket of continental sorrow, tucked away in the Sussex countryside. A man emerged from one of the smaller sheds. His shoulders stooped. He carried a block of wood and a small knife, and his eyes, when they briefly met ours, were filled with a deep, guarded caution. He gave a curt nod, more a twitch of the head than a greeting, and disappeared inside. "That is our man, Watson, the craftsman. Let us see what story his hands have to tell," Sherlock Holmes said. The sound of a tool scraping wood reached us first, a rhythmic, lonely rasp that ceased the moment our boots crunched on the gravel path. We had found the cottage, set back from the lane. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a stillness broken only by our approaching footsteps. Holmes rapped his knuckles on the oak door. It creaked open to reveal a man whose face was a mask of sorrow. His eyes were hollowed with grief, and his hands, the hands of a craftsman, were stained and dusted with fine, pale wood shavings. "Mr. Luke de Vries. My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are making some inquiries concerning the late Reverend Albright," observed Sherlock Holmes. The man's shoulders sagged at the mention of the name. He nodded slowly, his voice a low murmur, thick with the accent of his homeland. "The Reverend? Yes. A great tragedy. Please, come in," replied Mr. Luke de Vries. He gestured us inside. The small room was both workshop and home, smelling sharply of linden wood. Chisels and gouges lay in neat rows on a workbench, and a silent gallery of carved birds stood upon the mantelpiece. The only sound was the slow, heavy tick of a wall clock. "You knew him well, I take it?" "The parish speaks highly of his devotion to your community," Sherlock Holmes noted. "He was a very good man. To us he was hope." Mr. Luke de Vries answered. The woodcarver's answers were clipped, his gaze fixed upon a half-finished block of wood on his bench. It was clear he wished the conversation over. Holmes, however, leaned forward slightly, his own manner shifting from polite inquiry to one of intense focus. His charity was well known, as, it seems, was his appreciation for fine craftsmanship, stated Sherlock Holmes. With that, Holmes drew the small wooden cuckoo from his pocket. He placed it on the table with a soft, deliberate clack that seemed to crack the silence of the room. I saw de Vries flinch as if struck, his knuckles whitening where he gripped his workbench. "Tell me, Mr. de Vries, have you seen this object before?" "No." "I cannot say that I have," answered Mr. Luke de Vries. The denial was too swift, his eyes betraying the lie. Holmes offered no immediate challenge. Instead, his long finger rose to point at a small, delicate carving of a wren perched upon the mantel. "Your style is quite singular. The method you employ to render the feathers, this specific cross-hatching, is a signature in itself. Furthermore, the small gouge you use to form the eye leaves a minute but consistent imperfection, a slight flattening on the upper curve. It is present on that wren, on the fox beside it, and, quite unmistakably, here on this cuckoo," remarked Sherlock Holmes. The colour drained from the Belgian's face. He stared at Holmes, a sharp, ragged breath escaping his lips. The sound of his panicked breathing filled the small workshop. "I know nothing of this. I implore you, leave us be. My family has suffered enough," Mr. Luke de Vries replied. His voice, once heavy with sorrow, now trembled with the unmistakable quaver of profound fear. "It is not your past suffering that interests me, sir, but your present terror," Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes stood, retrieving the cuckoo and returning it to his pocket. We took our leave, the heavy door closing behind us with a sombre thud. As we walked, the silence of the cottage, no longer broken by the scrape of a carver's tool, felt heavier than before. "He did not carve that bird as a gift, Watson, nor as a simple sale. He carved it as a warning. The question is, for whom, or, perhaps more to the point, about whom," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The return journey to our cottage upon the downs was a silent one. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the flint-strewn lane, was the only sound to accompany my thoughts, which were a muddle of pity for the grieving woodcarver and frustration at his evident secrecy. Holmes, for his part, sat hunched in the trap, his chin upon his chest, his eyes veiled beneath the brim of his hat. I knew this mood of intense, inward concentration, and did not dare to break it. Upon our arrival he swept into our sitting room without a word. When I entered after dismissing the driver, I found him standing before the hearth. On the mantelpiece lay the artifacts of our case, the small wooden cuckoo, his notes on the tides, and a file of chalky soil. He paced before it, a restless shadow against the flickering firelight, the floorboards groaning under his measured tread. For a quarter of an hour, silence reigned, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the distant, mournful cry of a gull carried on the sea wind. At last, he stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his grey eyes alight with a fire that eclipsed the hearth's glow. "Watson, we have been viewing this case from the wrong perspective entirely. We have been asking ourselves who would wish to murder a gentle curate. That is the wrong question," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He picked up the small wooden bird, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger. "We have seen the terror in the man, as reported by Mrs. Hudson. We have seen the profound, yet fearful, grief in the artisan, Mr. de Vries. And we have this." "Why this, Watson? Why a cuckoo?" deduced Sherlock Holmes. "It is a peculiar choice of bird, Holmes, but I confess I cannot fathom its significance," remarked Dr. John Watson. "Think of its nature, Watson. Consider the cuckoo's defining habit, a marvel of sinister instinct. It is a brood parasite. It does not build its own nest, but rather lays its egg in the nest of another, smaller bird. The unsuspecting host then incubates the egg and feeds the chick, which, upon hatching, ruthlessly expels the host's own young from their rightful home." Sherlock Holmes responded. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. A log shifted in the grate, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. The connection, once illuminated, was as brilliant as it was startling. "It is not a memorial, Watson. It is an accusation. The carver, de Vries, did not leave us a clue to a simple murder. He left us a symbol. A cuckoo in the nest. An impostor. The Reverend Mr. John Albright was not the man he claimed to be. His voice was sharp, incisive, each word a hammer blow of logic." He placed the bird back upon the mantel with a decisive click. "Our curate was an infiltrator. One who took shelter amongst these poor Belgian refugees, only to betray them. This was not murder, Watson. This was an execution. A grim piece of justice delivered by those who had been wronged. The origin of this crime does not lie in our peaceful Sussex parish, but in the blood-soaked mud of Flanders." He fell silent, his gaze fixed upon the window, as the last vestiges of daylight faded over the channel. The scope of the affair had suddenly widened, its roots reaching back into the great, terrible conflict from which we had also recently emerged. He turned from the window, his course of action decided. "I think a conversation with our friend Dr. Reed is in order. His work with shell-shocked soldiers at the coastal hospital may provide the very insight we require into the psychology of this affair," explained Sherlock Holmes. The study of Dr. Alistair Reed was an oasis of scholarly quiet after the raw winds of the Sussex coast. A low fire hissed and popped in the grate, casting a warm, dancing light upon shelves of leather-bound medical texts and the glint of polished brass instruments. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, carbolic, and the pipe tobacco that Reed favoured. My friend, Holmes, had been uncharacteristically silent since our arrival, his long fingers steepled before him as he stared into the flames. Dr. Reed, a man whose gentle eyes had seen far too much of the war's grim aftermath, swirled the amber liquid in his glass. The faint clinking was the only sound for a long moment before he spoke, his tone measured and thoughtful. "It is a formidable theory, Mr. Holmes. An impostor, you say. But to what end? The man we knew as Albright was, by all accounts, a paragon of charity and piety. Dr. Alistair Reed said. Precisely. He was the perfect cuckoo, was he not? So perfect that none thought to question the nest he had occupied. But I am less concerned with his performance, Doctor, and more with the stage upon which it was set. You have tended to men returned from the front. Tell me, what does the crucible of war do to a man's identity? Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Reed set his glass down upon a coaster with a soft click. He leaned forward, the firelight carving deep shadows into his face, and his voice took on a graver, more clinical tone. It can shatter it entirely, or it can forge it into something new and terrible. We have a name for the tremors and the nightmares, the shell shock as the papers call it. But there are deeper wounds. Dr. Alistair Reed answered. He paused, his gaze distant, as if recalling a specific face from the wards. The firelight flickered across his weary features. Men who have seen and done things that cleave their life in two, a before and an after. For some, the man who returns is a stranger to the one who left. They carry a burden of memory so heavy that they might do anything to assume a new life, replied Dr. Alistair Reed. I saw it myself in the hospitals, Doctor. Men, hollowed out, haunted. Some would do anything for a fresh start, Dr. John Watson said. Holmes gave a sharp, affirmative nod, his eyes gleaming with an intense light. He had not asked the question for information, I realized, but for confirmation. He was fitting the last piece of a theoretical framework into place, and it is there we find our motive. This is not a simple case of a man fleeing his past, it is a case of a man importing his war, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Importing his war? Good heavens, Holmes, what are you suggesting? Wondered Dr. John Watson. I am suggesting, my dear Watson, that the Great War was not merely fought in trenches with bayonets and shells, stated Sherlock Holmes. He turned from the fire, his shadow looming large against the book-lined walls. There was also a war of whispers, of spies, of men who crossed lines not on a map, but in the very fabric of their allegiances. Holmes stopped his pacing and picked up the iron poker, gently stoking the embers. The fire hissed and flared, illuminating the fierce conviction on his face. So the curate's charity, his work with the refugees. It was all a front, Dr. John Watson inquired. The perfect front. What could be more unimpeachable than a man of God, tending to the very victims of the conflict he helped to create? Sherlock Holmes noted. The implication hung in the still air of the study, as chilling as a blast of winter fog. The curate had not simply been an impostor, he had been an enemy combatant, continuing his war on English soil. My God, Holmes. You are suggesting he was a German agent, answered Dr. Alistair Reed, or a collaborator. Or a man betrayed, seeking a vengeance so profound it required this elaborate charade. The identity is secondary to the purpose, Sherlock Holmes noted. He gestured dismissively with his hand, as if swatting away such simple labels. The key, I am quite certain, lies not with the drowned wretch himself, but with those he chose to surround himself with. The Belgians. Mr. de Vries, and his family. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes sprang from his chair, his earlier lethargy vanishing like mist before the sun. With familiar predatory energy he paced before the hearth. The firelight danced, accentuating the sharp line of his jaw as he turned. Their past is his present. The story of their flight from Flanders holds the secret to his death in Sussex. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The cuckoo in the nest. Good heavens! You believe one of the refugees themselves killed him? Dr. John Watson said. Precisely. The cuckoo was slain, Watson, but it was one of the original occupants of the nest who did the deed, explained Sherlock Holmes. He turned from the hearth, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. The scholarly quiet of the room was now charged with a palpable energy. We must now unravel their histories, their sorrows, and their loyalties. Tomorrow, We shall pay a visit to our refugees. We will hear their stories, and amongst the truths, we shall find the lie that cost a man his life," observed Sherlock Holmes. Our conversation with Dr. Reed had confirmed Holmes's theory. The case's foundations were not in Sussex, but in the blood-soaked mud of Flanders. We set out the next morning under a bruised grey sky, a chilling drizzle falling. Mrs. Hudson, her face grim, guided us along a muddy track to a repurposed tithe barn, where the county had housed several refugee families. The great oak doors groaned as we entered. Inside, the air was thick with boiled cabbage, damp wool, and the sweet smell of pine shavings. A low murmur of French and Flemish filled the space, punctuated by a child's cough. Partitions of plank and blanket created small alcoves in the gloom, each a tiny island of salvaged life. Observe, Watson. Order in the face of chaos. It is the first mark of a resilient people, observed Sherlock Holmes. His voice was low, meant only for me. Mrs. Hudson led us to a man sitting alone on a crate, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes burning with a fierce, restless energy. He was sharpening a small blade on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, a harsh counterpoint to the hushed sorrow of the room. "Mr. Holmes, allow me to introduce Monsieur Dubois. He came with our most recent arrivals," Martha Hudson said. The man looked up, his gaze sweeping over us with unconcealed suspicion. "Monsieur, 1,000 apologies for the intrusion. I am investigating the death of the Reverend Albright. I was told he offered you all great comfort," deduced Sherlock Holmes. "He brought food. He spoke of God. Food is real. The rest," said Monsieur Dubois. He shrugged, a gesture of profound bitterness, and returned to his stone. The scraping sound grew louder, more aggressive. "You came from the salient, I believe, near Zillebeek," observed Sherlock Holmes. The man's hand stilled. He looked up, his eyes narrowing to slits. "I saw the church tower at Zillebeek disappear in a cloud of dust. I saw the lake boil from the shelling. I saw things no man should see. Do not name these places to me as if they are points on a map. They are tombs," said Monsieur Dubois. We moved on, leaving the man to the cold comfort of his anger. Our next conversation was with a woman who clutched a threadbare shawl, her face a mask of perpetual anxiety. When Holmes posed a similar question about her journey, she merely shook her head, her voice a trembling whisper. "So much noise. The fire. We just ran. I do not remember the roads. I only remember my husband's hand, and then—" "Not," said Belgian woman. It was our third interview that arrested Holmes's attention. A young man, no older than 30, sat calmly repairing a fishing net, his fingers working with a deft, unhurried precision. He answered Holmes's query without a flicker of emotion, his eyes remaining on his work. "Yes, from that area. We were directed to evacuate via the road to Poppering. The route was congested, particularly near the crossroads at Vlamertinghe. The shelling was considerable, but distant," young Belgian man replied. His account was flawless, his tone clear. More a military report than a memory of terror. We took our leave, stepping back into the damp Sussex air as the barn door creaked shut, sealing the sorrow within. Good heavens, Holmes, a harrowing business. "Each story is a nightmare," Dr. John Watson commented. "Not each, Watson. Not each. 2 were nightmares. The third was a recitation," stated Sherlock Holmes. He stopped on the path, turning to face me, his grey eyes alight with the fire of the hunt. The drizzle beaded on the shoulders of his coat. Trauma shatters memory. It burns away detail, leaving only visceral emotion, as with Monsieur Dubois, or it smothers it in a fog of fear, as with the poor woman. But our calm fisherman, he gave us a gazetteer entry. He recalled crossroads and traffic conditions, not the terror of flight. His is a story that has been learned, not lived. "We have an impostor in the nest, Watson," Sherlock Holmes noted. His logic, as ever, was impeccable. Before my eyes, the puzzle pieces rearranged themselves into a far more sinister picture. That phrase, Watson, an impostor in the nest, it brings us back to the cuckoo, does it not? The carved bird in the dead man's hand. To understand why our calm fisherman is lying, we must first understand the other impostor, the man he may have had reason to silence. We must know everything about the Reverend Albright. "To his rooms, immediately," Sherlock Holmes pointed out, following my friend's logic, which now pointed away from the local populace and squarely towards the Belgian enclave. Our investigation led us to the late Reverend Albright's parish quarters. Mrs. Hudson, whose connections had secured us entry, stood at the threshold, her hands clasped nervously. The room itself was sparse, the air thick with a scent of beeswax and old paper. A simple cot, a writing desk, and a bookshelf filled with theological texts were the only furnishings. The silence was broken only by the crisp, metallic tick of a small mantel clock, counting away the seconds with unnerving precision. "The constable said I might be permitted to tidy the place, sirs. A man's final rooms, they ought to be set to rights. But it seemed only proper you have a look first, given your interest," Martha Hudson answered. "Your discretion is, as ever, invaluable, Mrs. Hudson." "Now, Watson, what do you make of this humble sanctuary?" Sherlock Holmes noted. Before I could venture a reply, Holmes was already in motion. His footsteps were soft on the floorboards as he bypassed the desk and the neatly made bed, going directly to the bookshelf. His long, thin fingers ghosted over the spines of the leather-bound volumes. I heard the gentle rustle of his cuff against the bindings, a soft, searching sound in the quiet room. "A man's library is a window to his soul, Watson. But a window may be dressed to deceive the casual observer," declared Sherlock Holmes. He selected a heavy book, bound in dark morocco, Parables of the Penitent. He held it for a moment, then tapped its cover with a knuckle, producing a dull, solid thud. He opened it, but instead of leafing through its pages, he ran a fingernail along the gilded edge of the paper block, creating the faintest scratching sound. Ah, the slightest variance in the gilt. A binder's error, or a craftsman's secret door. He produced a small penknife from his pocket. With the precision of a surgeon, he traced the edge until the tip of the blade stopped with a faint click, finding a nearly invisible seam. A moment later, with a soft crackle of stiff paper giving way, a section of the pages, cleverly hollowed out, came loose in his hand. Within the cavity lay a slim packet of oilskin-wrapped papers. "Good heavens, Holmes! Secret correspondence, you say? What manner of intrigue have we stumbled upon?" Dr. John Watson replied. "The curate's true sermon, I suspect," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He carried the packet to the writing desk. The rustle of unfolding papers cut through the hushed room, a sound amplified by the fading grey light of the afternoon. The documents within appeared to be simple shipping manifests, but the sharp rap of his fingernail on the page drew my attention. "Observe the unnatural repetition of certain words, Watson, and the faint pencil marks beneath the ink. It is a variant of the Alberti cipher, keyed, I would wager, to a passage from Scripture. Given our man's profession and the Teutonic sense of irony, I should think the Book of Job a likely candidate." Sherlock Holmes responded. For the better part of an hour, the only sounds in the room were the frantic ticking of the clock and the furious scratching of Holmes's pen upon his notepad as he worked. At last the scratching ceased. He threw his pen down with a sharp clatter that echoed in the stillness. "It is done. Our Reverend Albright was no shepherd but a wolf. Captain Karl Müller of the Imperial German Intelligence Service, codename Starling. His mission was to monitor refugee movements and identify skilled artisans for coercion or recruitment. He was a spymaster in a cleric's collar," Sherlock Holmes said. The revelation hung in the air, thick and cold. Holmes moved to the window, the floorboards groaning softly under his weight. As he stood there, The sound of a distant train whistle drifted across the fields, a mournful cry in the darkening afternoon. This operation is too polished. The cover story, the legend, too complete. This is not the work of a lone agent. I must consult a higher authority. That evening, a telegram was dispatched. The reply came with astonishing speed, its arrival announced by the urgent echo of a messenger's boots on the flagstones of our temporary lodgings. Holmes tore it open. His sharp intake of breath told me the news was grim before he even read the contents aloud. Starling confirmed. Highest level asset. Legend authored Berlin. Pre-war. Consider him extremely dangerous. Any associates more so. Proceed with utmost caution. M. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes folded the telegram with unnerving calm, the crisp paper crackling in the silence. The single initial M was all the confirmation he needed. Mycroft's involvement elevated this from a country murder to an affair of state. My God, Holmes, the signs of drowning I noted on the body. I treated them as a medical fact, the result of a tragic misstep. But this confirms it was no accident. It was an execution, commented Dr. John Watson, or a silencing. The question, Watson, is by whom? An Englishman who discovered his secret, or one of his own flock? The woodcarver, De Vries. His hands are skilled enough for delicate work, and his sorrow deep enough to hide any secret. It is with him we must now speak, declared Sherlock Holmes. Mycroft's telegram confirmed Holmes's gravest suspicions. With that certainty, we did not return to Baker Street, but drove our hired motorcar back into the Sussex countryside. We stopped before the timber-framed cottage of the Belgian woodcarver, Luc de Vries. A single lamp cast a yellow rectangle on the dark lane, and from within came the faint scrape of a tool against wood. Holmes rapped twice upon the heavy oak door. The scraping ceased, replaced by the slow tread of footsteps. The door groaned open, revealing the patriarch, his face a mask of weary sorrow in the lamplight, his hands stained and smelling of pine resin. Holmes spoke, his voice cutting through the night air. Mr. de Vries, may we have a moment of your time? It concerns the late Reverend Albright, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The Belgian's eyes, shadowed by grief, held a guarded intelligence. He nodded stiffly, gesturing us into a room that was both home and workshop. Wood shavings curled upon the floor, and on a workbench lay a half-finished, exquisitely rendered bird. De Vries remained standing by his bench, his hand resting near a chisel. My friend wasted no time. The man you knew as John Albright was, in fact, an agent of the German government. His name was Klaus Richter, and his work here was not of a spiritual nature. Sherlock Holmes responded. The old man's face remained impassive, a fortress of disciplined composure. Yet I saw his knuckles whiten as they gripped the wooden handle of the chisel. A log shifted in the hearth with a soft hiss, the only sound in the tense silence. His reply was a low rumble, his English precise but heavy with his native accent. He was a man who preached peace while his soul was filled with war. What he was is no longer of consequence. He is with his God now, whatever God that may be, replied Mr. Luc de Vries. Holmes pressed on, his tone hardening. This is not news to you, however. You knew his identity from the moment you saw him. You knew him from Flanders, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes moved to a small mantelpiece which held a collection of carved wooden figures. With a delicate finger, he indicated the newest of them. A cuckoo, its beak slightly open in a mocking call. This is your work, is it not? A fine likeness. But it is the wood that interests me. It is not English oak or Sussex beech. It is from a splintered beam of Ypres poplar, a piece you brought with you as a memento. You carved this bird, a symbol of the intruder in the nest, the day after Albright arrived. It was not a decoration, Mr. de Vries. It was a judgment, declared Sherlock Holmes. The woodcarver's composure finally fractured. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him. His eyes, once filled with weary sorrow, now flashed with cold, hard fire as he looked from the cuckoo to Holmes, jaw clenched. His voice trembled, not with fear, but with a profound and ancient anger. Yes, I knew him. I saw his face by the light of a burning church in Bozing. He was the officer who gave the order that took my sons from me. So yes, Monsieur Holmes, I knew the cuckoo was in our nest, replied Mr. Luc de Vries. Holmes's question was sharp and direct. And so you followed him to the river and exacted your revenge, stated Sherlock Holmes. De Vries drew himself up to his full height, his dignity a shield against the accusation. The fire in his eyes cooled to embers of profound conviction. No, I did not kill him. To do so would make my justice as filthy as his war. I am a father, monsieur, not a common murderer. But I will not shed a tear for the verdict the Cuckmere River delivered. To understand what happened to that man, you must look beyond this quiet village. You must understand the promises made in the mud and the blood of Flanders, promises made to the dead, that the living are bound to keep. Mr. Luc de Vries answered. Holmes stood in silence, his gaze fixed upon the old Belgian. The air was thick with unspoken history, a web of loyalties and hatreds stretching far beyond England's shores. As we took our leave into the cold night, I knew Holmes was no longer merely hunting a killer. He was unravelling the ghost of a war that refused to die. Unspoken words hung heavy in our small Sussex parlour. The mantel clock ticked steadily, while the sea-coal fire hissed and crackled, its pops and spits punctuating the tense silence. Luc de Vries sat rigid in his chair, his great calloused hands resting upon his knees, his gaze fixed upon the floor. Dr. Reed, his face a mask of concern, stood by the window, looking out into the gathering twilight. It was Holmes who finally broke the spell. The curate was not a curate. We have established this. He was, in fact, Hauptmann Klaus Richter, of the Imperial German Army. A name, I have no doubt, that is familiar to you, Mr. de Vries, declared Sherlock Holmes. The Belgian woodcarver did not look up, but his entire body seemed to contract, as if from a sudden, sharp pain. Holmes ceased his pacing, and stood before the man, his expression more sober than I had ever seen it. Richter was an intelligence officer operating near Ypres. His speciality was infiltration, posing as a friend to the local resistance, gathering names and locations. He would offer aid, only to lead his own soldiers to the very cellars and farmhouses where patriots were hiding. A cuckoo in the nest, laying eggs of death and betrayal, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's voice was low and even, reciting the facts like a litany. He gestured towards the small, crudely carved wooden bird that still sat upon our mantelpiece. Your comrades, Mr. de Vries, the men you fought alongside, the men whose families you knew, they were betrayed by him. They made a promise, did they not? An oath sworn over the bodies of their friends, that if they ever found the cuckoo, they would mark him for what he was. Justice, not for a court of law that could never understand, but for the ghosts of Flanders, observed Sherlock Holmes. At last, Luc de Vries raised his head. His eyes, sunken and weary, met Holmes's. There was no defiance in them, only a profound and terrible sorrow. Beside me, Dr. Reed let out a soft breath, his medical mind clearly grasping the terrible truth. My God, Holmes, are you suggesting that de Vries? Replied Dr. Alistair Reed. Holmes did not look at Reed. His attention was fixed entirely upon the woodcarver. You did not merely recognize him, Mr. de Vries. You followed him. You waited. You learned his habits, his nightly walk along the Cuckmere, and when the time was right, you met him there. You did not leave the bird as a clue for the police. It was a symbol, a branding. You fulfilled your promise, explained Sherlock Holmes. Silence descended once more, heavier than before. De Vries's throat worked, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, gravelly whisper, rough as unsanded timber. He smiled when he saw me. He called me friend. I showed him the bird before he went into the water, so he would know. For my son, For the others, he had to know, answered Mr. Luc de Vries. The confession hung in the air, a stark and brutal testament. Dr. Reed, his face pale but his expression resolute, moved to the Belgian's side and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Mr. de Vries, you are exhausted. Come with me. You need rest. Not more questions now," said Dr. Alistair Reed. He guided the broken man to his feet and led him from the cottage. The sound of their slow, crunching footsteps on the gravel path faded into the damp evening air. I was left alone with Holmes. He had turned to face the fire, his tall, spare figure silhouetted against the flames. "Holmes, what will you do?" "The authorities?" asked Dr. John Watson. He did not answer, his gaze fixed on the heart of the fire. He was watching the embers glow and fade, lost in a contemplation so deep that I did not dare to disturb it further. In that moment the question of English law seemed a small and distant thing, utterly eclipsed by the raw justice of a fallen field in Flanders. The wind that swept across the Sussex Downs that afternoon carried with it a singular loneliness. It whistled through the gorse and bent the long grasses in mournful waves, a constant, sighing companion to our thoughts. Holmes stood upon the crest of the hill, his tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against a sky the colour of slate. His gaze was fixed, not upon the distant shimmering line of the sea, but upon something far more remote, within his own mind. Beside me, Dr. Reed drew his coat tighter, the crunch of his boots on the chalky path, the only sound to break the wind's lament. "It is a grim business, Holmes. War does not end when the guns fall silent. Its ghosts walk among us for years to come, wearing the faces of living men," answered Dr. Alistair Reed. Holmes did not turn. For a long moment I thought he had not heard, so absorbed was he in his own internal counsel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, carried to us on a gust of wind. "Indeed they do, Reed. And these ghosts demand a justice. Our courts, for all their mahogany-panelled solemnity, are ill-equipped to provide," remarked Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent again, and I found myself studying my friend with some concern. I had seen him triumphant, I had seen him in the blackest of moods, but I had seldom seen him so profoundly troubled by the abstract nature of a problem. He was a man who thrived on facts, on footprints and tobacco ash. Now he was adrift in a sea of morality. "Holmes, you seem to be wrestling with more than just the facts of this case." "It is unlike you," remarked Dr. John Watson. "Because the facts, Watson, lead to a conclusion the law cannot comfortably accommodate. In London the lines were so often clearly drawn. A crime was a violation of the King's peace, the culprit a tear in the fabric of society. My duty was simply to mend that tear," observed Sherlock Holmes. He paused, picking up a small, sharp flint from the path. He turned it over in his fingers, its edges unforgiving, as if weighing the very problem in his hand. But here the fabric was already shredded on the fields of Flanders. The victim, Albright, was himself a predator, a cuckoo in the nest, Sherlock Holmes said. So Albright's betrayal was not just of his parish, but of his own comrades in the trenches. Maifa, cuckoo in the ney. Naifa tarry you me? Naifa tarry you me? Asked Dr. John Watson. Precisely. The man who ended his life, de Vries, did so not for personal gain, but to fulfill a promise made to the dead. He acted as an executioner, carrying out a sentence passed in a court of mud and blood. Tell me, Doctor, what does the law of England say to that? Sherlock Holmes responded. The law would say it is murder, plain and simple. But as a man who has signed death certificates for boys whose only crime was patriotism, I confess my own certainties have been shaken. Dr. Alistair Reed replied. A cruel irony. The man who sought justice for his comrades is to be condemned by the very laws he fought to protect, wondered Dr. John Watson. Holmes gave a short, sharp nod of agreement, a flicker of his old self returning. Inhaling deeply, he seemed to draw strength from the salt-tinged air, as if it could cleanse his mind of its troubling ambiguities. To hand this man, this woodcarver de Vries, to Scotland Yard would be to obey the letter of the law. It would also be a profound betrayal of its spirit. An injustice to correct an injustice, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He turned then, his face sharp once more in the fading light. The period of introspection was over. The thinking machine was re-engaged. A decision had been forged in the silence of the Downs. He clapped a hand upon my shoulder, his grip firm and resolute, and his eyes held the familiar, piercing glint I knew so well. My course is set. Come, Watson. There is a telegram to be composed, and then this Sussex air will have done its work. The matter of the Cuckmere Curate is at an end, Sherlock Holmes responded. The wind over the Downs had fallen silent, and a profound peace settled over our Sussex cottage. It was mirrored in my friend, who sat in his armchair, not with his usual restless energy, but with a deep stillness. The file on the Cuckmere Curate lay closed on the table. Dr. Reed, joining us for a final word, watched Holmes with quiet curiosity, his teacup untouched. His voice was low, a gentle probe into the silence. "And so, Holmes, what is to be the final entry in the official record?" Dr. Alistair Reed answered. Holmes drew a long, slow breath, the sound barely disturbing the air. He looked not at Reed, but into the heart of the crackling fire, its flames dancing in his grey eyes. His reply was measured, devoid of its usual sharpness. "The official record, my dear doctor, will remain precisely as it is, a tragic misadventure. The Reverend Mr. Albright, a man unaccustomed to our chalk streams, met his end by drowning. The coroner was quite satisfied," Sherlock Holmes responded. "I could not prevent a small start. After all, we had uncovered the false identity, the wartime vendetta, the calculated act of retribution. This conclusion seemed an extraordinary anticlimax. But Holmes, you cannot mean it. The man was an impostor, a German agent. And De Vries, he is a killer, whatever his justification," Dr. John Watson added. He turned his gaze upon me then, and it was weary but firm. "Was he, Watson? Or was he a soldier completing an engagement that began in the mud of Ypres? The man who called himself Albright was responsible for the deaths of De Vries's wife and sons. He hunted them. He used the chaos of war as his personal sport. His presence here, in this parish, was the final act of a gruesome hunt. Is it murder to slay a wolf that has followed you to your very door?" explained Sherlock Holmes. He gestured to a small object on the mantelpiece. A new addition. It was a beautifully carved wooden kingfisher, its painted plumage a flash of impossible blue. It had arrived that morning, with no note. "Mr. De Vries is a master craftsman, not a common assassin. The law of England has no statute to address a verdict delivered on a battlefield, even if the sentence is carried out years later, on a peaceful riverbank. To hand him to the police would be to ask a constable to untangle the Gordian knot of a world war. It is not justice, Watson. It would merely be a bureaucratic tidying up," observed Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Reed nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. He had seen too much in the field hospitals of France to disagree. "An act of moral triage, then. You have decided which wound is fatal, and which may be left to heal on its own." "I find I cannot fault your diagnosis," Dr. Alistair Reed answered. Just then the door creaked open, and Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. She carried a tray, not with more tea, but with a freshly baked seed cake, the warm scent filling the room. Her voice was as comforting as the aroma. "I saw the De Vries family in the village." Little Annalise smiled. "For the first time I've seen. They say they will stay. The parish has taken them to its heart, poor souls," responded Martha Hudson. She glanced at Holmes, a flicker of profound gratitude in her eyes, before retreating as quietly as she came. In her simple report was the true epilogue. The community had rendered its own verdict, one of compassion. As the afternoon waned and Dr. Reed took his leave, Holmes and I found our steps inexorably drawn to the banks of the Cuckmere. The water slipped by, a placid silver grey under the winter sun, A gull's cry, lonely and piercing, broke the immense quiet. The scene's tranquility bore no trace of the violence that had brought us here. "The world has changed, Watson. The certainties of my London practice washed away by a tide of blood. Crime is no longer mere greed or passion. It's now entwined with memory, grief, and nations. The shadows are longer, Watson, and far more complex," explained Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent, a stark silhouette against the pale sky, his gaze fixed eastward towards the continent where so many ghosts still walked. The case was closed, but I knew the questions it raised would long occupy his great mind. Here in the Sussex quiet, Sherlock Holmes confronted a new puzzle, the fractured soul of the 20th century.